One's computer. Okay, so we missed our lovely sort of like intro. Let's just ignore that. You'll just have to remember it. We're gonna build a counter component using a class component. So let's import it and we'll call it just counter. And we'll create a new folder for it and call it here. And then we'll render it here. Okay, so I'm going to create a new folder here and go counter as the directory, and then we're going to have a component called counter.js. And I'm going to mute people. Good. I could hear some background noise, so I muted you. I can't hear you, so that's just give you a nod. Okay, cool. So we're going to build a counter. Let me now create my counter directory, and oh, I know I already have it. And it shouldn't be a directory. Okay, we're building a class component first, and then we'll change it to use a state hook. So import React, and then the component. Oh, yes. And from React, and we're going to call this our counter. And I always forget, so let's do it now. Yeah. Export it, and in here we have our constructor function. And this is where we want to set our initial state. So here we're going to have a counter, so let's call it counter, and start off at 0. And we want to have a render function that returns, let's just wrap everything in a div to begin with. And in here, we want to have a number. So we have to reference our state. So let's go this.state and then the counter. Then we want to be able to increment it. So we're going to, I guess, have a little button we can click on. And we'll have add, and then we'll have something that happens when we click on it. So when it gets clicked, we need to execute some kind of function, right? So let's, we could do this two ways. We could do it inline here, or we could write a function for it. Let's do it the way that we remember how to do it, using a function here. So let's say something like add 1. And all we want to do when we click on it, this add 1, is add 1 to the state. So we'll have to at some point call this.setState and pass in the object that we want to date with the properties, which is counter. And let's just say it's going to be counter +1. Okay. Let's see. I might have missed something. Anyone can see anything that I've missed? I'll run it in a second to see what areas we have. Anything look like it's out of place?
Line 10.
Yeah.
When you reset the counter within the value, do you have to call this .counter? .state.counter. And line 17, you're missing one left bracket for the closing button tag.
Boom. Good morning, Mincy.
Not enough wine last night.
Awesome. Anything else? Can we spot anything else?
Line 9, add one, you should there should be an event that you can pass in for that, right?
We can do. I don't need it. So arguments in JavaScript are optional. So I could pass it in and not use it. But at the moment, I'm not actually triggering anything off the event itself. I'm just using the event. Cool. Let's run it and see what happens. I think that might be those things. That is up. So where is my? Yeah. Oh, can you see it all the way up in the corner? Look at that. It's all the way up here. Can you see it? Yeah. Okay. So yes, we have a functioning component, right? This will take a while to get to. No, stop. Cool. Thanks, Mincy, for your good eyes. So we've made a component, but we want to manage state. So we've chosen the option of using a class component with a constructor function to manage it. So let's see the same thing, but using a state hook. So I want to kind of keep this. So let's move this into a new file called counter old. And let's write the same thing, but using a state hook. So we have to do the same thing. We import React, but this time rather than the component, because we're going to use a functional component or a class component, we want to access the use state hook, and this comes from the same place. So rather than a class, we're going to write a normal functional component. So let's call this counter. This is we're storing an anonymous function inside of this variable. So that's how we can use functional components. And then we can export it, export default counter. Okay, functional components need to have a return statement. So we return, let's have a look at just grabbing this stuff. Now, I don't have any state, so I don't need, we'll think about this in a second. And we'll think about that. Bring this down. Open div. Okay, we'll come back to that in a second. So how does the state hook work? Well, we need to set the initial state. So the way that the state hook works, we do something like use state and start with the initial value that we want, and we'll say we start off with 0. And when we call this function, it gives us back 2 things that we're going to store in here. So the first thing is always going to be the property that we want. So let's say this is going to be the counter. And the second is always going to be the thing that we call to change it. So let's say, for example, set counter. So this is the same as saying the initial state is at 0, and then the set state, when we call it, to update it. So here we can access it by saying this is the initial, this is what holds it, this .state.counter, for example. This is the initial state, and if you want to change it, this is the function we're going to call. So here, if we do the same thing, and we have our add one, and here, what we want to do, I guess we can just put it here, is say set counter, and our new value is going to be counter +1. Because we don't no longer have to do this.state, we just have access to the variable itself. So we can use counter and just say, we'll set counter to be +1. And here, all we need to do is add 1 now. And inside here, we just need to reference the counter. So let's compare these side by side. And first of all, make sure it's working. I'm sure there might be, Mincy, I might need your eyes. Can you see anything?
The name of the folder, the file, sorry, you've got count old rather than counter old. So further down the line, that might cause a problem.
Let's just name it right, counter old. So I should be loading this file and not doing anything with this one. This is just for documentation. Let's have a look at it. Nothing hopefully should change. We might get some errors. Cool. We're still adding 1. If we want to add it by 2, we can just change it to add by 2. This is now a bit redundant. 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 15, 18. Cool. So this is an alternative way to thinking about managing state in React. And this gives us a couple benefits. It's a little bit cleaner to read. We don't need to go through a constructor function to initialize it. And we don't need to always constantly reference this.state to access our variables. So one of the main reasons behind this is to sort of make it cleaner and easier to use. And now it means we don't need to think about too much about having either functional components or class components. We can mostly just use functional components, and when needed, have these state hooks to manage state as we want to. So this is an example of using a state hook. Thoughts and questions?
I'm just trying to figure out why you'd use each. So like if it was a bigger project where you had more stuff going on, which would you use?
Yeah, so there'll be naturally some classic answers to that question, which is like, what is the team most comfortable using? What's the convention behind it? And is there sort of a common desire to move towards using hooks rather than class components? And I would use those as a way to think about it. But by and large, hooks is the more recommended way to manage state. But they both access the same sort of internals, which is the lifecycle methods. But I think it's a much better, when we're learning about it, to start with the lifecycle methods and going that way, and class components to manage state, rather than jumping straight into hooks.
So it's basically almost like a design decision. Okay, cool. Thanks.
Pretty much, yeah. You'll see most people talking about hooks as the way to, and the motivation behind it is to make it cleaner and easier to use. Yeah. Any other? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I wanted to ask you if this is more ideal for a situation maybe when you have just one state. What if you have multiple states?
Nice. Let's try it. So let's say, for example, we have, let's go 2 counters. I'm just very, very original naming. Let's say counter, add 1, and counter 2. This one will add 2 to it. So that adds 1. And this is set counter 2. And we need counter 2 here. counter 2, say counter 3, counter 2 plus 2. This is so confusing. I made this really difficult for myself with it. And then we need 2 counters over here, and that's going to be counter 2. And here we want add 1 and add 2. Let's see. This should be the way to do it. You just add more here. I can't believe this is so far. I haven't changed it. I should probably whack it straight in the middle, but okay. So this is add 1, and this is add 2. Yeah?
Cool. Thanks.
No worries. Any other thoughts or questions?
Yeah.
Yeah.
This might be a bit of a dumb question, but you know, you've got use state brackets 0. If it was like for a different situation where you needed a string or like true or false or something, would you just still whack that in there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So let's say, for example, this was like a string, and we could just keep saying hello. Maybe. I don't know what's going to happen. We should be able to concatenate strings, right? Let's do it that way around. Irritatingly, I put the button on the wrong side. Yeah?
Yeah, thank you.
So it just starts off with the initial value, and then whenever you call set the sort of like the function to update it, it will just be a simple JavaScript evaluation. So as long as that works, it will then take that value and update it to that value. So you could set it to be something very different, so long as if it set as an original string, I could set it to be 1, and that would always go to 1, right? It's just reassigning the value. Good question. Cool. Any other thoughts at the moment? Yeah.
Would testing for the hooks just the same?
Exactly the same. Yeah, exactly the same. Because this is essentially like an implementation detail. As long as you still are making your search on the page once it's rendered, then your test shouldn't change. Yeah, you would render your component, query the page to find the text that you want or the element, and then assert that it's there. And whether you use a state hook or whether you use a component did mount or a sort of set state to manage it, it should be exactly the same. Good question. Any other thoughts or questions? Cool. Okay, so what I want you to do now is spend 20 to 30 minutes building counter, a component or something equally simple. Keep it super simple like this, and either build it with your class component first, and then basically copy what I did, do your class component first, and then build it with a state hook, or you can dive straight into the state hook. Have about 20 or 30 minutes with that, and then I want to have a look at the effect hook. So let's spend some time building a functional component with a state hook for the next 20 to 30 minutes. And then we'll gather back at 11 and see where we got to. And we'll have a few more minutes, or we'll introduce the next hook. Make sense? Awesome. All right. Have a good go and see everyone at 11. I'll be here if you need.
Thank you.
Recording. Cool. Cool. I added a couple star rules to shunt things across the page because I didn't like it up in the top left. So, and now it's just in the middle of the page that we can all see clearly. So that's where at the moment we have a functional component with a state hook, and now we're going to just like hack this component to not just be a counter. We're just going to try and use an effect hook and just do something very different to what counting is. So normally this would probably be in a different component, but I can't bother to write a new component. So we're just going to demonstrate using an effect hook. And I thought the simplest thing to do would just be doing something very similar to what we did before in one of the headline, in the sort of news summary, the headlines example, where we made a request to the API and got information from it, but using the component did mount lifecycle method. So let's jump back to for a second and look at our diagram. So one of the other reasons to use a class component, not just to manage state, but is to have access to some of the lifecycle methods. So we can trigger events depending on whether the component renders, whether it gets updated, or whether it gets unmounted from the page. But we can do the same thing using hooks, and we're going to use the effect hook in this example. So let's have a look at how we can use it. So I'm going to do exactly the same thing, but rather than use the component mount hook to fetch data from the API, I'm going to use the effect hook. So I'm going to have up here on the right, let's go back in here and have a look at this example. This one. So here's how we did it using the component mount. We added another method here, took the request, and then we called set state. So let's have a look at how we would do it in this component. So rather than use a component mount lifecycle method, which we don't have access to because we're not a class component, we have to use a hook. So we have to import it. So rather than just the use state, let's use the use effect hook. Let's use it. So we can use it like so. And what we need to pass in here is essentially an anonymous function. And we have an optional set of things that we want to update, or triggers to sort of cause an update. Now, what this means is, depending on what we put in here, it will either do the component did mount, it will do the component did update, or the component will unmount. So the three different lifecycle methods. Let's have a look at them. These ones here. So depending on how we write this function, it will either do one or some of these things. And we can sort of look at the docs to figure out how we want to write it to make sure that we do it. At the moment, we only want to focus on just the component maps. We want it to run once, rather than any time it gets updated or when it gets removed from the page. So the equivalent at the moment is to keep the second argument to the use effect. The first argument is the thing that you want to happen. And the second argument is when you want it to happen. So this time I'm going to keep an empty array because I just want it to happen once. And that's how you have to write an effect hook if you just want it to happen once when the component mounts. So here would be where I put all the information that you think about. So I just go grab all this stuff. Guess I don't want to log it. I just want to, hold on. Just want to pass it. And then I want to get the data and not set state because I don't want to do this anymore. So as a result, here I set some initial state with an empty array. So I'll have to do the same thing here. So set with an empty array. And here I set it to be items. So let's do the same thing, items. And therefore my callback function to update it will be set items. You can call it whatever you want, but the convention is to name them the same kind of thing. So then if I want to update it, I don't call this set state, I just call set items. And then I don't need to pass an object, I just as an argument pass in the thing that I want to change. Like so. So I guess I could also make this all on one line to make it a little bit more readable. Get rid of that. Okay, so then I actually want to see it on the page. I'll just do it below here. And how do I do it? Well, here I just loop through the items. So I have access to the items. So items, and then I'm going to loop through it. .map. Click get all the items, and let's just create a. I'm not going to go too much into this. I just want to display like a little bit about them. So let's wrap them each in a paragraph element and get the web title. Okay, let's have a look at what errors we're getting before we compare and contrast the two different approaches. Cool, it's a bit big, but there we are. So that's how we use the effect hook to replicate the same behavior as a component mount function. We don't need to have different lifecycle methods. We just use the same function, use effect, but passing in different arguments. And we set an initial state in the same way using our state hook. And then we use an effect hook to update it as we need to. Notice there's fewer things that we need to do. And that's the comparison side by side. Thoughts, questions? What do you see on the page? That would be interesting. So this part here is probably the thing that we need to like practice or just like get used to is writing the use effect function. It takes in essentially the thing that you want to happen is the anonymous function, and then how many times or when to do it. That's the second argument. And we can either leave this blank, we can give it an empty array, or we can fill it with specific things to watch as when it gets updated, depending on how, when and where we want to do it. So at the moment, if we just focus on a component mount, we pass in an empty array. Any thoughts or questions? Yeah.
Why is it called effect?
Why is it called effect?
I think for me it's visual effects, so I'm just trying to like figure out what's the effect.
And the effect here is saying. I think the naming convention comes from the idea that we're triggering some behavior to happen. So we want this. I guess when we think about side effects, a function when it runs has like a return value, but side effects are things that happen as a result of the method executing and not just the return value. Let's say that when we're talking about an effect here, it's saying I want this side effect to happen, which is to request data from an API and then update state. So the effects are usually, when we think about them in programming, is like either going to be the return value if that's the main point of them, or it's going to be a side effect, which is sort of, and I don't want to say unintentional, because it's the opposite of essentially a pure function. Pure functions have no side effects. It's just simply you put in an input and you get out something. A side effect is something that happens that's not the return value.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Any other thoughts or questions?
Yeah,
Minty?
I think I'm not quite sure at the use effect, the second argument you pass in the array, that's the part that I'm not quite understanding. Does that array referring to the state, the items empty array, or does it related to, you said component demand, how many method that you're gonna call?
Yeah, it's essentially saying if you want to watch for any updates, anything that gets updated would trigger this block of code to happen. So I could put anything I could put in counter, for example, or I could put in items, or I could put in anything else that gets updated. It just watches for that thing to change, and then we trigger this block of code to happen. If you keep it empty, it says we'll trigger it once, and that's it, which is the effect is a component did mount. That's literally it. And this comes from the documentation. So we can have a look at the React docs to understand more about it. But that's the only thing that's slightly fiddly about it, is the fact that we just have to remember the conditions for when we want to use this effect hook. We either put things inside the array, and you can put multiple things if you want to always to trigger on specific different things to update, or not. So it's something to play around with when in just a minute when you have a go at it yourselves.
So that means that whatever you put in that array is the things that you want to change the state of when you trigger the fetch call.
No, this is something that says if this changes, I would then want to trigger whatever this block code is. The set state has to happen from whatever is the callback function here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So you can do it as a result of this trigger, but this is saying things to watch essentially.
Okay.
Yeah. And I say I'm not going to watch anything because I only want this to happen once. If I wanted to keep updating it, then I'll put the things to watch in here.
Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah, I get it now.
Yeah. Which makes if you put things in here, it makes this use effect hook like a component did update, which looks at any update.
Ed, so with that things to watch on line 4, the empty array, does it always have to be array? If you're expecting something like an object or hash, would you have to change that, or it has to be?
Yeah, it has to be has to be an array, but you can put inside of it things that you're watching.
Okay.
So, for example, the initial state for counter is an integer. Items is an array, so you can put any of these variables inside this list.
Okay.
So it's just a list of things to watch.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Cool. All right, how we go? You have probably already some example code from the headlines work that we did before. Otherwise, incorporate into your counter a use effect hook that executes once when the component renders. And for that, you'll need to set some initial state and grab some data. And you can use it from this API, or you can even use a different one. I'd probably just keep it simple to begin with, and see how it goes. And let's regather. Let's go another half an hour. And if you would like my help, I'll be here. Sound good? Cool, awesome.